Unit 5 and westward expansion. Westward expansion is the westward movement of the citizens of the United States. And after the Revolutionary War, by the time we get to 1820, our population has grown by a sixfold, which means we're 6 times larger than what we were during the Revolutionary War, which was around 1 million people. So we're having more and more people come here, immigrants that are looking to achieve their dreams. And as they come, we're going to push more and more west. The westward movement expansion varies depending on who you're talking to, but we're going to say it's from that 1830 time frame to about 1912 when Arizona became a state. The idea that the settlers would move west and that we would occupy more and more land was supported by the government. It was supported. I know Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States and the author of the Declaration of Independence, talked about a country filled with liberty, and that we were going to occupy all the land. All of North America would be supported and be a part of America. The idea that the U.S. government supported us was evident by giving up cheap land to settlers that could move out there. The phrase of manifest destiny was a phrase used first by a journalist in 1848 by the name of John O'Sullivan. And what the phrase means is it's the country's duty and its destiny to expand and possess all the territory west to the Pacific Ocean. So you're talking about after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, you're going to move towards expanded areas, which will eventually become territories. And then as they get to be around 60,000 people, they can become a state, and we'll eventually just keep moving west. And we'll make treaties and we'll have wars, whether it be in the South with Mexico, or treaties in the North with Great Britain. We'll slowly eventually move our way west. Most of the settlers that were moving this way came because they were looking for an opportunity to improve their life. And usually it was by owning land. It was through farming, mining, timber, trapping. And one of the big pushes that actually had a majority of people that started to move west was the economic recession of 1837, when, if you remember, we were talking about our president at the time, Andrew Jackson, couldn't think of his name there for a second, old Andy. He decided not to fund the National Bank, and the National Bank then went under, and we had a lot of debt, and jobs became scarce, wages went down, and people didn't have anything, so they decided to move. Initially, these were people that, again, were looking for areas such as living off the land. But after that, people that were going to make up the town, merchants, blacksmiths, things like that, they followed behind and then would establish a town. When you start to move west with a group of people and you run into people that have already been there, there's going to be conflict. And so we're going to have a bunch of conflict, much like we did when we inhabited the East Coast. We will run into the Indians. There will be disputes. There will be skirmishes. There will end up typically being a large battle or war where the white settler with superior technology will commandeer or take a piece of land and push the Indians off. We'll make an agreement with the Indians, and then sometime later, 20 years, 30 years later, usually, almost always, it's the white man that breaks the treaty and then takes more land and pushes the Indian back. And this is true as we start to move forward into the Missouri area, and we're going to start making Indians move more and more west over to the Rockies, and then we're going to take that land. Native Americans would either assimilate and become part of our culture. And that's what assimilate means. They took in and became part of the white culture, but a great majority of them resisted. And because of that, the view of the Indian became harsher and harsher and more severe. An example of this is the Black Hawk War. Black Hawk was a chief of the Sauk Indians, and they had been living in the Illinois area, but as we had moved into that area, especially the northern part, they had been pushed out. And then after a few years, they came back to settle into their traditional hunting grounds in the northern part of Illinois. And the white man in that didn't want them to come back. And there was a skirmish that broke out, which had the governor then of Illinois call out the militia to remove the Indians. War will break out, and Chief Black Hawk, the leader of the Sauk Indians, will believe that through a dream, he and his followers, his tribesmen, would wipe out the settlers. And so they go to war full on, and the United States government and the militia of Illinois saw it differently. They were pounded. The Sauk Indians were. They were broke up, and they were forced to move on to Indian reservations, and the white man took all of that land. And that's just like a microcosm, the Black Hawk War, that you're going to see with the Sioux here in a little bit, in the Fort Laramie, and the Plains Indians, where we're going to take their land away. It's going to happen all the way throughout the South and on the West Coast. Well, on the heels of what I was just talking about, there was another treaty, Fort Laramie. Laramie is in the Wyoming Territory, where we're going to run up against a lot of different Plains tribes, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Apache, the Sioux being the number one. And in 1851, we signed an agreement that the Sioux would be given certain lands in Montana, in that territory, North Dakota, in exchange for them to give up the land they actually had that was more east, and we would agree that neither side would harass each other. Well, that lasts until the white man breaks the agreement. It was renegotiated and signed in 1868. It was broken, and they were forced to go to other lands. And the end result was in 2007, the Fort Laramie agreement that was the grounds of the lawsuit between the Sioux and the United States government. The Supreme Court found the Sioux and their land had been taken from them, and they were awarded $1 billion for that, for the Sioux tribe, and the Sioux turned it down and said, no, we still want our land. And that probably is not going to happen. But $1 billion is a pretty good chunk of change, and the Indians said, no, we're not. We'd rather you give back our land to us. Some of the trails we're talking about, there's a number of them. There's California, Santa Fe, Oregon, Mormon. We're going to talk about 2 right now, and then these are going to branch out, and we'll have that in our map exercise. But to the north, you're going to have the Oregon Trail. Both are going to start in Missouri, of all places. Independence, Missouri was the jumping off place for whether you were going to go south or where you're going to go north, or you're going to go north and then you're going to break off to go to California. The Santa Fe Trail goes from Independence, Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico, some 780 miles. And we're going to have the white settlers moving there from 1821 to 1860. And there's going to be a huge number that are going to move through that area down there for large farming, mining. We're going to take slaves in that area in Texas, and we're going to have conflict with the Spanish and the Mexican government. And then the trail that led north was the Oregon Trail. And that's again going to go from Independence, Missouri, and it's going to work its way all up along the northern part, the same route that Lewis and Clark went on. And it's going to end up in Portland, Oregon. And we'll take a look at this more in a couple films. One of the groups that came out that is obviously prevalent to us because we have a large LDS group here in Boise was the Mormon migration. The Church of the Latter-day Saints and its founder Joseph Smith came about in 1832, I think. Joseph Smith founded the church. They lived in New York. He moved his flock to Illinois on the outskirts at that time in 1830, and his church grew. But as his church grew, there was conflict between the people of Illinois and the church, and there was disputes, and there was arguments, and there was fights. I don't want to go into it. I don't want to offend, but there was resistance on both ends, and it'll eventually end up being where the LDS Church will say, okay, we're going to get the heck out of Illinois because there was conflict. Joseph Smith will be incarcerated, and he'll be put in prison, and he'll be murdered in prison by a mob for, I guess, the crimes that those people felt he was committing. And they finally said, as I mentioned, in 1839, this tension had come. Smith is going to be killed, and the follower of Joseph Smith, a gentleman by the name of Brigham Young, will take the church, which had grown to a sizable amount, well over 20,000 people at that time, and they will migrate to the west, and they'll come out to the Great Salt Lake Basin over there by Salt Lake City, some 1,000 miles. And in 1847, he's going to settle there, and that's where the Mormon church is today. The main headquarters is, and the area will become a territory in 1849, and then become a state in 1896. And some continue on to here in Boise and eastern Idaho, but that is a quick blurb on the Mormon migration. Finally, the last thing I just want to go over in this section is there's numerous territorial disputes on our northern border between us and Great Britain. Great Britain is in Canada, modern day Canada. We're down here. We had disputes in the Northeast, in Maine, again in Minnesota and the Great Lakes, and those get resolved. War almost breaks out in the West over where the line would be between Great Britain and the United States in 1849. Or was it 1844? 1844, a war almost breaks out. Finally, Britain will back down, and we will settle on the 49th parallel, being the border between the U.S. and Great Britain. The Oregon Territory will become the territory in 1844 after the signing between Great Britain and the United States. I'm sorry. We finally get a resolution in 1846. Oregon becomes a territory in 1844, and there's a resolution to this in 1846. Oregon will become a territory along the 49th parallel, and then Oregon becomes a state in 1859, the first state out there in the West, just before the Civil War, about a year and a half before the Civil War. So we now have ourselves moving all the way to the West, and in the North, we'll have some disputes that we'll go back and talk about now here in the South between us and Mexico and Spain, and but we're going to stop right there and take a look at a couple maps and a couple films.